let you know that Heather will be back in September on the 29th for another lecture called Freedom for Who? Indigenous Nations and the American Revolution. So be sure to put that on your calendar. Tuesday, September 29th at 6:30 p.m. Right here. And I know she will be back again several times in November, so keep an eye on the calendar. And I will also read our library land acknowledgement. The library board has recently approved the library's new land acknowledgement. The Ann Arbor District Library acknowledges that it benefits from the colonization of Indigenous lands. The library pledges to support Indigenous people and cultures through partnership with and recognition of Anishinaabe artists, writers, teachers, and performers. Please visit aadl.org/land for more information about this land acknowledgement. And now I am so excited to welcome Heather. Heather Bruegl, inspired by a trip to Wounded Knee, South Dakota, quickly developed a passion for Native American history. Curiosity for her own heritage led her to Wisconsin, where she has researched the history of Native American tribes of that region. Heather is a graduate of Madonna University of Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in U.S. History. She currently travels and lectures on Native American history, including policy and activism, and is a PhD student at UW Green Bay. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, everyone. Oh my God, traffic's crazy. I'm surprised. I'm grateful you guys made it because Ann Arbor's under construction. I am so excited to be here this evening to be able to talk to you guys about something that I'm super passionate about, which is history, but also specifically Indigenous history, and combining that with my love of early colonial and Revolutionary War history. And what better way to do that than to talk about probably the greatest breakup letter of all time, which is the Declaration of Independence, in my opinion. And so I'm very stoked to be able to maybe give you a different way to think about it, maybe in a way that you hadn't thought about it before. So I'm really excited to share with you. So we're just going to dive right in. As Marissa said, my name is Heather. I'm a citizen of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and a first-line descendant of the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican. My pronouns are she, her, hers. There's all my contact information on there, so if you think of a question later on and you want to shoot me an email, by all means, please do so. I'm very accessible. You can find me anywhere, and I'm I'm busy, but I always have time for people's questions. So I think the microphone went out. That's okay. I just want to make sure people can hear me. I mean, I can talk loud, but I want to make sure you guys can hear me. So yeah, and then my website, I also list like other talks that I'm doing in different locations, and I'll list whether they're in person, virtual, and there's usually a link on there where you can register for things. But I will be back again in September to talk more about the American Revolution, and then I'll be here in November again as well to talk about some other things relating to Indigenous history. So we already honored the land, so I just wanted to make sure that we were all aware of that. I think land acknowledgements are important, especially when you put action behind them. Some institutions do not, but most try to, so I'm really grateful to the library that they always put some action behind that, so that's really awesome, and I'm very excited about that. So this map is really cool because it moves. And anything that moves catches my attention. So this map offers a time-lapsed vision of the transfer of Indian land between 1776 and 1887. So 1776, obviously, the colonies declare independence. 1887 is the passage of the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act, that was passed by Congress, and what it did is it took reservation land. So after tribes were moved to Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma, it took the reservation land and it divided it up even further. So it sent out allotments. And so I really think this is interesting because number one, the 13 colonies are kind of already mapped out. Number two, it starts off by really showing that almost the entirety of the United States in 1776 was still part of it was indigenous land, right? And I think that is really important, that we have some sort of visualization of when people like to say, can't you just get over it? It's in the past, doesn't matter. I like to show them something like this, because you get over it. It's just, this is important, right? This is Turtle Island, and I think it's important to note that we very much are people who have, given up a lot, right? This is, stolen bodies on stolen land built the United States, and I think that that's something that we need to make sure that we talk about as much as other folks would have us not talk about it right now in this day and age. So, yeah, fair warning. Tonight you're going to learn something that could possibly be banned in the future. So take that information with you. So yeah, when people say get over it, it's in the past, it's not. It's still active today, right? Reservations, I like to tell people reservations were supposed to be temporary because the goal was to get rid of us. So the fact that we have these reservations is very important. So you can't talk about the American Revolution without first talking about the French and Indian War. And the reason, and trust me, it all links. You might think I'm taking you down a weird path, which I kind of am, but it all links back together. Because we're here to talk about the Declaration of Independence. What does the French and Indian War have to do with that? I promise you we'll get to it. It'll all absolutely make sense. So I'm just going to give a brief summation of what the French and Indian War was. So in Europe, it was known as the 7 Years' War, and this was a conflict between France and Great Britain over who would have imperial power in the New World. So the 7 Years' War was the larger war. Some historians have argued that the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, is actually World War I. Because France and Britain are big empires that are going to different parts of the country or parts of the world, and they're colonizing it, right? And so France and Britain both have colonies here in the United States, in what becomes the United States. So France expands into the Ohio River Valley, and conflicts between the two nations, between the two empires, really grow. So in 1754, the French built a fort in modern-day Pittsburgh as a stronghold that the British repeatedly attacked. Between 1754 and 1755, George Washington, fighting under the British flag, had a number of victories. In 1757, the tide of war changed when William Pitt, the new British leader, looked at the conflicts as a way to build the British Empire. In 1762, King Louis of France was like, this is too much. We're fighting. Wars are costly. We're not even fighting someplace close to home. We're fighting across the ocean. So we need to do something about it. So he begins to call for talks of peace. The British government was also interested in peace talks. Again, the war was becoming costly. That also does play a role, but my bigger argument is that the American Revolution was about land and not taxes. And we can discuss that later on. So a French negotiator proposes the land in North America to be redistributed. So the British would gain all of the French territory east of the Mississippi. Spain would keep Cuba in exchange for handing Florida to the British. The French territories west of the Mississippi would go to Spain, along with the port of New Orleans, but that later changes. And France would keep some territory that they had in Africa and regain the Caribbean islands. So in 1763, we have the Treaty of Paris that is signed. So there's a number of treaties called the Treaty of Paris. For example, the one that ends the revolution is also called the Treaty of Paris, but that's a completely different one, so we want to make sure we put dates on those. So this Treaty of Paris, 1763, ends the war. Due to the provisions in the treaty, the tribal nations that had been fighting on either for the French side or the British side were not mentioned anywhere in the treaty, even though the lands that the French and the British were fighting over were indigenous lands. Why would they consult the tribal nations? There was absolutely no need to. The territory of Louisiana transfers from France to Spain. France later regains control of it, and then later the United States purchases it in the Louisiana Territory Purchase. The Mississippi River, except for New Orleans, sets the British boundary. So we have the Mississippi River. But the dynamic is changing between Native nations and colonists after the signing of the treaty that we were not consulted on, the treaty that took our lands and divided it up. So there's going to be some conflicts that are going to be happening. So we have something that eventually is called the Proclamation Line. And the Proclamation Line was set to stabilize the relationship between the colonists and the native tribes. After the French and Indian War, the Crown started to tighten the control it had over the colonies. So the 13 colonies are in red, and the Crown is starting to crack down a little bit on it. The land west of Appalachia was home to Indigenous peoples. So the line, if you notice on the map, actually follows the ridge line of the Appalachian Mountains, right? So the Crown is saying, don't cross this line, right? Everything from the mountains to the ocean, coolsies, but don't go past the mountains. Many tribal nations had already been moved from the New England area, and they had been moved past that line. The British also inherited the alliances that were made between Indigenous nations and the French, but they weren't sure what to do with them. So this, quote, Indian problem is something that's plagued the United States even before it became the United States. So were these people, were they subjects of the Crown? Were they independent nations? Jeffrey Amherst, who was the Governor General in North America, said that Indigenous people were, quote, the vilest race of beings that ever infested the earth, right? And that he was, quote, fully convinced the only true method of treating those Indians is to keep them in proper subjugation. So we could also then argue that the paternalistic relationship that the federal government has with tribal nations started after the French and Indian War. We have to subjugate them. He discontinued many practices that had been in place with the French, including gift giving, which was culturally significant because it helped seal political relationships. So where, you're signing contracts or whatever, gifts would have been given, right? We're going to give a gift to seal this deal, so to speak. These acts, in addition to colonists encroaching westward, broke any possibility of an alliance between the Indigenous people and the British. So, what was the purpose of this proclamation line? The main goal of it was to prevent further conflict from Native nations, specifically following the uprising of Pontiac's Rebellion, which is very much central here in the Great Lakes region. Pontiac's Rebellion was to halt westward expansion. And so the line is in response to halting that westward expansion. It is a strict boundary that was drawn along the Appalachian Mountains from Georgia, north to the Canadian border, separating the British colonies and, quote, Indian Territory. The proclamation designated the land west of the Appalachian Mountains as in Indian Territory, theoretically protecting it from the immediate encroachment of white settlers. What was the impact on the colonists? Well, it restricted the colonists from settling on land they considered rightfully theirs, particularly those who had fought in the French and Indian War, leading to deep resentment and accusations of tyranny. So we're getting somewhere. Something's starting to boil. So what is the historical significance of this line? It is a major early cause of the American Revolution. That is the starting point that begins to drive a wedge between the colonies and the crown. It's not the taxes that come afterwards to pay for said war. It is this line. And I will argue that all day long with somebody. I like to argue. Many settlers ignored it making it largely ineffective in preventing expansion, and it signaled a breakdown in trust between the colonists and the crown. So the crown says, don't cross that line. The colonists are like, watch me, I'm gonna do it. So there's some tension that's building up. And I want you to think about what happens if someone comes into your home or onto your property after they're not supposed to, right? Think about what you would do, keep that in mind, and we'll get to what actually happens. So the land across the mountains was nice. It was profitable. And so this leads to some land speculators and leads to something called Pontiac's Rebellion. So I just want to give you a brief timeline of land speculation and the lead up to the proclamation. So between 1756 and 1763, we have the French and Indian War. In February of 63, the Treaty of Paris ends that war. In the spring, Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Uprising, I've heard it called many different things, begins, which is an uprising to stop British encroachment. On October 7th, the Crown issues the proclamation by King George III. It creates the imaginary line. Post-October, still 1763, land speculators seek to purchase land privately, viewing the prohibition of being able to settle there as temporary, or try to get special exemptions for land grants, or for soldiers to get soldier land grants. One of the most notorious land speculators was George Washington. In 1768, the treaties of hard labor and Fort Stanwix are negotiated by British officials to open up new land for settlement, largely rendering the proclamation line obsolete in certain areas. And in 1774, the Quebec Act extends Quebec's boundary to the Ohio River, further restricting the colony's access to Western lands, contributing to revolutionary sentiments. Again, everything points to it's about land, and I'm going to prove it to you when we get to the Declaration. So, what's the impact of this line on land speculators? Speculators invested heavily in land companies, planning to buy Western land and resell it to settlers. The proclamation prohibited governors from granting lands in this region, and it invalidated many existing unproved claims. You lost money, right? You were out whatever you spent. The speculators claimed that there was a restriction on wealth. The Crown sought to keep westward expansion under their control, rather than allowing private colonial development, cutting off a key source of revenue for the colonial elites. The speculators felt that it was a violation of their rights. Many colonists, including the land speculators, believed they earned the right to this land through their participation in the French and Indian War. We helped you stop French expansion. We should be able to take claim to that land. And it led to defiance. So land speculators, like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, largely viewed the line as something that was going to be temporary. Something that would appease the native nations. And they continued to survey and or purchase the land in defiance of the royal crown. And so I'll briefly just go into, I want to give you just a little background on Pontiac's Rebellion and the coming about of this line. So Pontiac was an Odawa chief who led a surprise attack against the British in Detroit and other British forts in the Great Lakes region. The offensive was mostly successful, and in June of 1763, there were only 3 forts that remained in British control: Fort Pitt, Fort Niagara, and Fort Detroit. So there was a plan. They were all going to hit these forts at the same time, British forts at the same time, and take them down. In Michigan, it was Fort Detroit and Fort Michilimackinac. Michilimackinac fell, Detroit did not. The proclamation line of 1763 heavily restricted, again, land speculators from making private purchases from tribal nations. So they were They were purchasing the land, but they were purchasing it from tribal nations, and so the proclamation again makes that null and void. It restricts settlement because again, Pontiac forms this rebellion to stop the encroachment of settlers coming in. Again, a number of tribal nations have pre-revolution have already been moved out. They've already been moved out. The specifically the New England tribes. So think about tribes that were in New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey. They had already been forced out, right, early on. And so there was, they were west of the mountains, and so the Crown was like, let's stop that. The proclamation line, in a weird way, and I say weird because I still have to sometimes work it out in my head, was an early form of land back. A very early form of land back in a very weird way, because we've already moved you out of the seaboard. We put you west of the Appalachian Mountains. We're telling our colonists not to settle there. They need to stay east. You're going to stay west. And it's going to keep the peace. We're giving you the land back. Maybe, sort of. I don't know. But again, Washington, Jefferson, and other founding fathers didn't care. They decided that they were going to purchase the land. And so there were some proclamation goals and outcomes. So containment was one. The proclamation aimed to prevent further costly wars with tribal nations, like Pontiac's Rebellion. We just came off the French and Indian War, and now we have to fight this other uprising. That costs money, especially when your home nation is across an ocean. How are they going to get all that stuff to you? Regulatory control. All future land purchases were to be made by royal officials, not private citizens or speculators. This was to prevent fraud and manage land distribution. And what was the reaction? The restrictions caused deep frustration as speculators and settlers considered it unfair on their expansion, contributing to the growing divide that leads to the American Revolution. This takes us to the Declaration of Independence. And we'll just have a brief timeline of the Declaration, the greatest breakup letter of all time. It's not you, it's me, but it is you. And I'm going to give you 27 reasons why as to it is you. So the Declaration was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4th, 1776. Prior to that, on June 10th, Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. It's really good if you've never read it. I recommend it. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee from Virginia proposes a resolution for independence to Congress. On June 11th, the Committee of Five is tasked with drafting the document. Thomas Jefferson is part of that committee. July 2nd, Congress votes in favor of the Lee resolution establishing independence. July 4th, the final text of the Declaration is approved and sent to the printer. On July 8th, the first public reading ever of the Declaration occurs in Philadelphia. And on July 19th, Congress orders the document to be officially written on parchment for signing. And beginning on August 2nd, delegates begin signing the document. So it doesn't happen on July 4th. That's just when we were like, cool, we're going to be independent now. Okay, nobody started signing on that day. They didn't start signing till August, and it went for the rest of the summer. People were coming in and out. So the way that we talk about that part of history frustrates me a lot because I feel like everybody thinks it all happened on July 4th. It did not. There were steps. So Congress appointed Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert Livingston to draft the document. And so Jefferson drafts the document. He writes a whole bunch of beautiful language. Benjamin Franklin and John Adams and the others on the committee read over it, and they're like, we're going to make some tweaks. We're going to change some things here and there. We are going to then put it to Congress and have it approved. And so in it, there are 27 grievances, 27 reasons why we're breaking up with you, Great Britain, okay? The most famous part of the document, I think, is probably the beginning, where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I bet you we all don't know what those reasons were for breakup. We can speculate what they were. But there were a number. He's dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He's making us quarter large bodies of armed troops among us, right? There's a reason why there's, in the Bill of Rights, there is an amendment, I forget the number, I feel like it's 6, that says that we as citizens do not have to quarter soldiers in our house. Because the citizens of Boston had to do that. And they were like, nope, not doing that. So it goes on and it goes on and it goes on and names all these horrible things that King George does. And the order is very significant. So the first one, it's we're not liking that. Second one, we're really not liking that. And it keeps growing, right? The claims keep getting worse. And so by the time we get to the 27th Grievance, we are really ticked off. And we are telling you, King George III, why we're breaking up with you. But we're going to do it in a way that offends 2 groups of people, right? So the 27th Grievance reads, "He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions." He has excited domestic insurrections and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Let's think about that for a second. There is a racial slur in the Declaration of Independence, the greatest document in the world, the document that inspired the French Revolution, the document that inspired the Declaration of Sentiments and the fight for women's right to vote, women's suffrage, the document that inspired the UN's Declaration on Human Rights. The last reason that the colonists give for separation with the crown is because they can't cross the mountains. They can't have the land that is beyond the Appalachian Mountains, because when they go over there, they get attacked. And that's King George. But what they leave out is the violence was perpetrated by the colonists, invading indigenous lands west of the mountains, in indicating the king for unleashing the merciless Indian savage on the inhabitants of our frontiers. The Declaration was not referring to a specific event, but rather to the recent escalation of violence, which was caused by the colonists invading the native lands west of the mountains, in response until about 1890 and the massacre at Wounded Knee. Between 1776 and 1783, U.S. troops destroyed more than 70 Cherokee towns, 50 Haudenosaunee towns, and at least 10 multi-tribal towns in the Ohio Valley. Jefferson, along with others, would call for the extermination of indigenous people who fought against dispossession. The grievance reveals that the original sin of the United States is twofold. America was built by the labor of enslaved people on stolen land that belonged to indigenous people. It tells you right there what the war was about. It lays it out in a document that is known to all of us, that it was about land. Yeah, taxes may have played a part, and wanting to be free may have played a part, but also when we talk about freedom and liberty, who are we talking about that for? There was one group of people that was for, and it was white male landowners. It wasn't the rest of us. It wasn't the, quote, peasants or the indentured servants. Most certainly was not the enslaved people, right? So the merciless Indian savages phrase in the Declaration of Independence, penned by Thomas Jefferson, who happens to be, weirdly, and I know this is a problem and I fully admit it, one of my most favorite historical characters because he's so complicated. I did my senior thesis in undergrad on him, and whew, that was a doozy. So those words penned by Jefferson reflects a foundational racist narrative used to vilify Indigenous people to justify the removal. The legacy legitimized land theft, massacres, and systematic cultural genocide by framing settlers as civilized victims defending against subhuman threats. A myth that continues today, right? I still have people who come up to me and are like, wait, I thought we killed all of you guys. Nope, right here, standing right here. It creates a justification for violence. This rhetoric was used to rationalize colonial land grabbing and virtuous violence against Indigenous people, framing white self-interest as God-given right to land. That's using like the doctrine of discovery. That's using religion. It dehumanizes, right? That phrase dehumanizes Indigenous people by calling us merciless and savages. Engage in school and continue to study history. I'm consistently learning, analyzing, thinking about different things. My husband probably thinks I'm the weirdest person in the world because we'll be sitting there maybe watching a comedy and I'll be like, did you ever stop and think about? And he's like, that has nothing to do with the movie. And I'm like, I know, but this thought's in my brain and I need to get it out. So I love this photo of myself. It was taken in Philadelphia in Independence Hall, in the Declaration Room, and the table behind me, there's a cane sitting on that table, and it's Thomas Jefferson's cane, and it's to symbolize where he was sitting in that room. And so I was like, you know what, gotta take a picture of myself standing in front of where TJ was. So, because as wonderful as that document is, as powerful as those words are, I'm someone who can also look at the document and go, words have meanings and consequences, and I can look beyond and I can see what is there. And so that legacy is we are still here as Indigenous people. We fought in the American Revolution on both sides. We fought in the French and Indian War on both sides. We fought in the War of 1812 on both sides. And today, in the United States of America, Indigenous people serve at a higher rate per capita in the U.S. military than any other group in the United States. So we're still here, and we're still making a difference. The only thing that we ask is that when we are talking about history, we actually have a conversation about it and talk about it through a critical thinking lens. And so I looked at a number of sources when I was carrying out this thought that I have. So first, the document I looked at was the Declaration of Independence. These rest are books on here that I absolutely love. The Rediscovery of America by Ned Blackhawk is stellar. It is thick and it's kind of dense at times, but there's some really great information in there. And then, of course, if you don't have a People's History of the United States in your personal library, please go to your independent bookstore and buy it, or come to your library and check it out. The book by Rebecca Nagel, By the Fire We Carry, is also great, but I also want to plug, and I forgot to put it on here, Rebecca Nagel of Cherokee Nation released a 6-episode podcast series called First America. The episodes are about 30 to 40 minutes long. There's 6 episodes, they're all out, and it talks about what I just talked about. Please listen to it. It is wonderful. You can stream it wherever you stream podcasts. But with that, I'm going to say this now before I forget. Thank you guys for coming out and dealing with traffic, to learn something you didn't know, to maybe sit in the uncomfortable and be here with me and learn about a piece of history that you maybe thought you knew, but now you can see it in a different light, and I am super grateful. We do have time for a few questions, and Marissa has a microphone, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and she'll come over with it. But thank you guys so much for coming out. I really appreciate it.
Does anyone have a question?
I actually had a question. I was just curious, you were talking about the removal of those that were on the East Coast and in the North New England colonies. How many were actually removed and how many just died because of all the disease that was brought over?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Okay, so I don't have exact numbers. However, I will say in the
Percentages?
yeah, I would say there would definitely be a large percentage. So during the mid to late 1600s, you had the Pequot War and you had King Philip's War, which definitely took out a lot of tribal nations. In fact, during Pequot War, the Pequot were, quote, exterminated. And I say put that in quotes because there were some Pequot that survived, but they weren't allowed to say they were Pequot anymore, or they were shipped to the Caribbean as enslaved people. By this time, you know, some of the Lenape have already been moved. The smaller tribes that all we know are names now, if I had to put a number on it, and I'm going to be very, thoughtful in this number, I would say maybe 40%, 45% had been moved. Maybe another 20 had been killed. So, and this is just in the New England area. And New England is complicated because there's a lot of smaller tribes. Like when I lived in New York for a period of time, I was like, oh my gosh, I was trying to do like a tribal history of New York, which I'm still working on like 10 years later, because there were so many smaller tribes along the coastal area. But you also had tribes that were able to make alliances and they were able to stay, like the Wampanoag were there for a very long time. In the east, in western part of New York, the Haudenosaunee were there for a very long time. And removal in the southeastern part didn't really start to happen until Andrew Jackson was president, so 1830 with Indian removal. So that's my best guesstimate. If you email me that question, though, I will look at my sources that I have at home and get you a more accurate number. Okay. Yes, you had a question?
How did the Indians defend themselves? What kind of weapons did they have?
Oh, gosh, there are all
Especially
sorts
early
of
on.
things. Clubs, spears. Once trade started, you were able to get metals, you can make axes. And then obviously, once trade really got going, we came in contact with guns and things like that. So just weapons. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, guns didn't come into the equation until later on. Mostly it was tools and things that you could create with rocks and wood and clubs. Like I've been to a number of museums where I've seen war clubs.
Settlers had firearms.
Yes. Yep. Any other questions? Yes.
Just to piggyback
Yes,
on
please.
his question.
Yeah.
Just, from what I remember learning, the Indians or Native Americans, they weren't fighting in the same way that the colonists or the British or French were fighting. They were hiding in the woods and they would ambush the soldiers or settlers.
Yep.
So even though they didn't have guns, they had
There were still other
nature,
ways.
yeah.
Yep.
to help
Guerrilla
them.
warfare is what we would call it now. Yep. Any other?
I have some maybe technical questions. One is did the language of the 27th Grievance, do you have any idea if that changed through different drafts? Was it always the last one, seemingly the most important? Was it always worded in the same way? So there's that question. And then also wondering, my understanding was that for many Native communities, initially at least interactions with white folks were kind of if they sold land, the understanding was that was for that one person, that one generation, and it wouldn't continue on and pass generationally. And so I'm wondering if by the 1750s, 1760s, had they had enough contact and relationships to realize that oh no, if this is sold, it's they think it's gone forever.
It's gone, yeah. Yeah, by that time, there had already been enough experience in the Eastern Seaboard to understand that when they sold the land, it was gone. So if we look at the sale of Manhattan, if you break down the myth that we're told, the Lenape thought they were sharing the land with the Dutch settlers. And so obviously the Dutch were like, no, you sold it to us. And then, so yeah, there was a lot of understanding going on. Plus they were very much, you were coerced into kind of signing the land away. And so that's why Pontiac, I think was able to raise this confederacy, because they're like, wait, we know what's going on here. We've seen this happen. And particularly what was interesting is when they could see the difference in French colonists and British colonists, right? French were coming and they weren't bringing, and not to say that they were like nicer at colonizing, they were not bringing families, right? They were marrying into the tribes, learning the language, and engaging that way. The British were bringing whole families, and they were bringing women, and they were like, wait, these people are not leaving. They are bringing more and more people, and so the population continues to grow, and so they're like, logic would state, where are these people going to go? So there's that. With the language of the 27th Grievance, it was tweaked, but the sentiment was still the same.
Thank you.
Yep. Can we do one more? Yes.
How is Canada similar or different? How is Canada similar or different compared to the United States with regards to their history compared to our history with regard to Native rights, Native treatment, that sort of thing? Was it similar or different?
Canada is just as bad as the United States in their treatment of Indigenous people. I do not feel confident in my knowledge of Canadian Indian law and policy to be able to speak to that more, but I do know that they, even with the way tribal nations are recognized in Canada, it's very different. They have something called the Indian Act, which, again, I'm not confident in my own knowledge of it. I'd have to look it up. But it, recognizes tribal nations differently, and it's very weird in how they do it, but it is just as bad as the treatment here. So they also did have boarding schools in Canada. They call them residential schools. Those were horrible. Those were awful, just like the schools that we have here. But the treatment also was very bad as well. And even creeping into modern contemporary history, it's still not that great. I know that the Pope, not this one, but the Pope before, what was his name? Francis? Okay. Had gone to Canada to visit tribal nations and apologize for residential schools. But weirdly enough, never came to the United States to do the same thing. It's like they were here too. So it's just as bad, but I'm not super confident to give you more information, and I don't want to give you wrong information. But that is some research that I'm working on, because I do want to, not that I think we need to say, oh, it was better here or not as bad there. I mean, again, there was no such thing as a good slaveholder. So there was no country that didn't treat its Indigenous people. You could look at Australia, too. Australia, with the Aboriginal people, were awful to them as well. So it didn't matter where you were at. It was just as bad. That was a really long answer to say, I don't know. Well, thank you guys for coming out. I appreciate it so much. And don't forget to come back in September, where we will talk about the American Revolution and the roles that Indigenous people played in it, and even give you some names of some really cool people who were there. So, yay. Thank you so much.